A rancher hired her to cook, but every morning she tried to seduce him. The ranch sat far from the noise of the city, surrounded by wide fields that seemed to stretch forever. Early mornings were always quiet there. The sun rose slowly over the land, painting the sky in soft orange colors while the wind moved gently through the grass. For Daniel, the rancher who owned the place, mornings were the easiest part of the day. They required no talking, no thinking about the past, only work. Daniel had lived alone for several years. The house used to feel different once. It had laughter, music from an old radio, and warm meals waiting on the table. But after his wife passed away, silence became his constant companion. At first, neighbors visited often, bringing food and kind words, but over time those visits stopped. People returned to their own lives, and Daniel returned to his routine. He focused on cattle, fences, and long rides across the land. Work was simple. Work didn't ask questions. Work didn't remind him of loss. The only problem was cooking. Daniel never enjoyed it, and after living alone, it became something he avoided whenever possible. Most nights he ate whatever was quick, canned beans, dry bread, or something he could heat without effort. The kitchen slowly lost its warmth. The stove gathered dust. Even the smell of coffee felt lonely. One evening, after burning another meal he tried to prepare himself, Daniel finally admitted he needed help. He placed a small advertisement at the general store in town. It was simple: cook needed for ranch, live-in optional, honest work, fair pay. He didn't expect many responses. Ranch life was not easy, and most people preferred jobs inside the town where life was more comfortable. 3 days later, he received a call. Her voice sounded calm but determined. She introduced herself as Alina and asked if the position was still open. Daniel told her yes, and they agreed to meet the next morning. When she arrived, Daniel noticed right away that she did not look like someone used to ranch work. Her clothes were clean and neat, and she carried herself with confidence. Her eyes moved carefully, observing everything: the barns, the trucks, the wide fields. She smiled politely when she greeted him. "I can cook," she said simply, "and I work hard." Daniel studied her for a moment. He wasn't sure what to think. She looked younger than he expected, maybe in her late 20s. There was a seriousness in her expression that made him curious. "Ranch life is quiet," he warned. "Long days, not much company." "That's fine," she replied quickly. "I prefer quiet." Something in her tone made him pause, but he nodded anyway. He showed her the kitchen, the small room she could stay in if she chose to live there, and the basic routines of the house. She listened carefully, asking practical questions. Nothing felt strange at that moment. By the end of the day, he decided to give her a chance. The first morning she worked, Daniel woke to a smell he hadn't experienced in years: fresh bread, real coffee. Something warm cooking on the stove. He stood in the doorway quietly, surprised. She moved around the kitchen with confidence, as if she had always belonged there. Sunlight entered through the window behind her, and the room suddenly felt alive again. "Breakfast is ready," she said without turning around, as if she already knew he was watching. Daniel sat at the table slowly. The food was simple but perfect: eggs, toast, and fresh fruit. He took a bite and realized he had forgotten how good real food could taste. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded but didn't speak much more. During the first week, everything felt normal. She cooked 3 meals a day, kept the kitchen clean, and even organized the pantry better than it had been in years. The house felt less empty. The sound of dishes and soft music playing from her phone replaced the silence. Daniel appreciated the change but kept his distance. He believed in clear boundaries. She was an employee, nothing more. Each morning she woke earlier than him, preparing breakfast before he returned from checking the animals. At first, he thought it was simply dedication to the job, but slowly, small details began to stand out. She started greeting him with longer smiles. She stood closer when handing him coffee. Her tone became softer, almost playful, though she never said anything directly inappropriate. Daniel ignored it. Maybe she was just friendly. Maybe he was reading too much into it because he had lived alone for too long. One morning, he entered the kitchen to find her already waiting at the table instead of cooking. She looked at him for a moment before speaking. "You work too hard," she said gently. He shrugged. "It's ranch life." She laughed softly, but her eyes stayed on him longer than necessary. He felt slightly uncomfortable but pushed the feeling away. Days passed and the pattern continued. Nothing obvious, nothing he could point to clearly, just small moments that felt different. She began asking more personal questions. how long he had lived there, whether he ever thought about leaving, what his life was like before. Daniel answered briefly but avoided going too deep. He didn't like talking about the past. Still, he couldn't deny that the house felt warmer with her presence. The kitchen lights stayed on late into the night, and sometimes he heard her moving quietly after he went to bed. He wondered what she was thinking, what she was planning, but decided it wasn't his business as long as she did her work well. Then one morning, something changed. He walked into the kitchen as usual, expecting breakfast ready. Instead, she stood close to the doorway, almost waiting for him. When he stepped inside, she moved aside slowly, her arm brushing against his. The contact lasted only a second, but it felt intentional. Daniel paused. She smiled again, calm and confident, as if testing something without saying it aloud. He sat down without commenting, but inside he felt a warning grow. This situation could become complicated if he wasn't careful. In a small town, people noticed everything. Rumors traveled faster than the wind. He had built his reputation through years of honest work, and he wasn't willing to risk it. As he ate breakfast, he felt her watching him quietly. Not in a rude way, just attentive, focused. For the first time since hiring her, Daniel realized that this job might not remain simple. The mornings at the ranch slowly began to feel different. Daniel noticed it even before he fully understood why. The air felt heavier, as if something unspoken waited between him and Alina every time he stepped into the kitchen. She still prepared breakfast early, and the meals remained perfect. Fresh coffee, warm bread, and careful attention to small details showed how seriously she took her work. But now, she lingered longer near him. When he reached for a cup, her hand sometimes met his at the same time. When he spoke, she watched him closely, as if studying every reaction. Daniel tried to treat it like nothing had changed. Routine was his protection: wake early, feed the cattle, check the fences, keep conversations short and focused. But even routine could not hide the growing tension. One morning, she laughed at something small he said about a stubborn horse. The laugh stayed longer than the joke deserved. Her eyes softened as she looked at him. "You should smile more," she said. Daniel gave a polite nod but returned to eating quietly. He was not used to personal comments. On the ranch, words were usually practical. As days passed, the pattern became clearer. She began dressing slightly differently in the mornings, nothing inappropriate, but clearly more careful than before. Her hair was styled instead of tied back simply. She chose brighter colors instead of plain work clothes. Daniel noticed but said nothing. Inside, he felt uneasy, not because she had done anything wrong, but because the situation felt like it was moving towards something he didn't want. One afternoon, he finished repairing a fence earlier than expected and returned to the house for water. He stopped when he heard music playing softly from the kitchen. Alina was moving around while cooking, humming quietly. For a moment, the scene looked peaceful, almost like a memory from his past life. She turned when she saw him and smiled warmly. "You're back early," she said. "Fence was easier than I thought," he replied. She handed him a glass of cold water, standing close enough that he could smell the fresh scent of soap and cooking spices. He stepped back slightly without thinking. Her smile faded just for a moment before returning again. Daniel realized she noticed his reaction. That evening, he sat alone on the porch after dinner, thinking. He respected her work. She had brought life back into the house, but he worried about misunderstandings. He had seen situations like this before in small communities where kindness became confused with personal interest. He promised himself he would stay clear and respectful. The next morning, however, made things harder. When he entered the kitchen, she was already seated at the table, waiting. Breakfast was ready, but instead of moving around the kitchen, she watched him as he walked in. "Good morning," she said softly. "Morning," he replied, sitting down. She poured coffee for him slowly. Her movements were calm, almost careful, as if she wanted to make every moment noticeable. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke again. "Do you ever feel lonely out here?" The question caught him off guard. Daniel paused before answering. "It's peaceful." "That's not the same thing," she said gently. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he focused on his food. He didn't want to discuss loneliness. That word carried too much weight. She didn't push further, but the question stayed in the air between them. Over the next week, she found more small ways to start personal conversations. She asked about his childhood, about how he learned ranch work, about what his favorite meals were when he was younger. Daniel answered briefly, but noticed how carefully she listened. It felt like she was trying to understand him beyond the surface. At the same time, her actions became more deliberate. She waited for him before starting breakfast instead of finishing it early. She sometimes walked with him toward the barn, even though it was not part of her duties. One morning, she reached out and brushed dust from his shoulder. The gesture was quick and harmless, but it felt too personal. Daniel stepped back slightly. "You don't have to do that," he said calmly. "I know," she replied with a small smile. "I just wanted to help." Her tone was soft, but he sensed disappointment underneath. That afternoon, Daniel drove into town for supplies. While loading feed into his truck, he overheard two locals talking near the store entrance. One mentioned Alina's name casually. "She's new here," one man said. "Heard she's had a rough time lately." Daniel pretended not to listen, but the conversation stayed in his mind during the drive back. Maybe her behavior came from something deeper. Maybe she was trying to feel safe or secure in a place where she felt uncertain. Still, he knew he needed to protect both of them from misunderstandings. The following morning, he decided to speak gently but clearly. He sat at the table after breakfast instead of leaving immediately. "Alina," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I appreciate the work you do here. The ranch feels better with you here." She smiled, but her eyes searched his face. "But I want to make sure things stay professional," he continued calmly. "This is a workplace, and I want you to feel respected here." The smile on her face grew smaller. She nodded slowly. "I understand," she said quietly. Her voice sounded controlled, but Daniel sensed emotion behind it. For the rest of the day, she spoke less than usual. The kitchen became quieter again, and Daniel wondered if he had hurt her feelings. But he also felt relief. Boundaries needed to exist. The next morning, however, the pattern returned. She greeted him with the same warm smile, the same attentive behavior. Nothing inappropriate, nothing obvious, but still intentional. Daniel realized this was not simply friendliness. Something else drove her actions. The quiet tension between Daniel and Alina did not disappear after their conversation. Instead, it changed shape. It became softer on the outside, but stronger underneath. The ranch remained peaceful, yet something unspoken moved through the house each morning like a silent question waiting for an answer. Daniel noticed that Alina became more careful with her actions. She no longer stood too close without reason. She no longer brushed dust from his shoulder or lingered beside him while he drank his coffee. On the surface, everything looked professional again. But her eyes still searched his face as if she hoped to see something more than simple appreciation. Daniel kept his routine steady. Work gave him clarity. When he rode across the fields checking cattle, the open land helped him think clearly. He did not want complications. He did not want rumors. Most of all, he did not want to hurt someone who might already be struggling. One afternoon, rain clouds gathered earlier than expected. Daniel returned from the pasture before sunset. As he entered the house, he heard quiet sounds coming from the kitchen. Not music this time, not cooking. He paused when he realized Alina was speaking on the phone in a low voice. "I'm trying," she said softly. "I just need time." Daniel stepped back so she would not know he heard. He did not want to invade her privacy, but her voice carried worry. Not frustration, not anger, worry. That evening at dinner, she seemed distracted. She forgot to add salt to the soup, something she had never done before. When Daniel gently mentioned it, she apologized quickly. "You don't usually make mistakes," he said calmly. She forced a small smile. "Everyone makes mistakes." Her eyes looked tired. The next day, Daniel decided to visit town again for supplies. While waiting near the counter at the general store, he saw Mrs. Harper, an older woman who knew most of the town's stories. She greeted him warmly. "I heard you hired that young woman," she said casually. "Yes," Daniel replied. Mrs. Harper lowered her voice slightly. "She's had a hard few months, bad relationship, some debt problems, not many family members around." Daniel listened quietly. "She's proud," Mrs. Harper continued. "Doesn't like asking for help, but sometimes people try to secure their future in ways that aren't always wise." Daniel understood what she meant without her saying it directly. When he returned to the ranch, he noticed Alina sitting on the porch steps instead of inside. She stared at the open land as if searching for something far away. He stood beside her without speaking for a moment. "It's going to rain tonight," he said finally. She nodded. After a pause, he spoke again, this time more directly. "Are you in trouble?" She looked at him quickly. "What do you mean?" I mean, is there something worrying you? I've noticed you seem stressed. For a second, she looked ready to deny it. Then her shoulders relaxed slightly. I owe money, she admitted quietly. From before, it follows me everywhere. Daniel did not interrupt. I thought if I could find a stable place, maybe things would settle down, she continued. But sometimes stable doesn't feel secure enough. Her words were careful. She did not mention her earlier behavior directly, but the meaning was clear. Daniel sat down beside her. You don't need to earn security by being anything other than what you were hired for, he said firmly but kindly. This ranch is a job, a fair job, that's all. She looked down at her hands. I know, she said softly, but sometimes people believe they need to offer more than work to keep a position. Daniel understood now. Her actions in the kitchen were not driven by simple attraction. They were driven by fear, fear of losing stability again. You don't need to impress me that way, he said calmly. I respect hard work, that's enough. She nodded slowly, though tears gathered in her eyes. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, she said. I just thought maybe if I became more important to you, I wouldn't lose another place. The honesty in her voice removed the last piece of misunderstanding. Daniel felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that the truth was simple. Sadness that she believed her worth depended on more than her skills. You are important because you do your job well, he said. Nothing else is required. Rain began to fall lightly around them, tapping against the porch roof. For the first time since she arrived, Elena seemed smaller somehow, not weaker, but more honest. That night the atmosphere inside the house felt different, not tense, not uncertain, just real. The following morning, Daniel woke earlier than usual. He walked into the kitchen and found Elena already working quietly. She wore simple work clothes again. Her hair was tied back without extra care. Her focus stayed on the stove. Good morning, she said in a normal tone. Morning, he replied. The distance between them felt clearer now, not cold, just defined. Over the next several days, her behavior changed completely. She no longer lingered. She no longer searched his face for hidden meaning. She worked steadily and professionally, but something else changed too. The meals became even better. The house felt organized and peaceful. Elena moved with confidence again, but it was different now, not trying to impress, just doing her job well. Daniel respected that. One evening after finishing dinner, she spoke quietly. Thank you for being direct with me, he looked at her. Most men would have taken advantage, she continued honestly, or misunderstood or encouraged it. Daniel shook his head slightly. That wouldn't help either of us, she nodded. For the first time, there was no tension in the air, just understanding. Outside, the ranch remained the same, wide fields, open skies, long, quiet mornings. But inside the house, something had shifted in a healthier way. Daniel realized that sometimes what appears as confidence can hide insecurity. And sometimes leadership means protecting not only yourself, but the other person's dignity too. Elena no longer tried to become more than the cook. After their honest conversation on the porch, life at the ranch slowly settled into a new rhythm. The quiet tension that once followed every morning began to fade. Instead, a calm understanding replaced it, like clear air after a storm. Daniel noticed the change immediately. When he walked into the kitchen now, Elena greeted him with a natural smile that felt lighter and more genuine. She no longer watched him carefully, waiting for hidden reactions. She focused on her work with steady confidence, moving through the kitchen with purpose. For Daniel, the house finally felt comfortable again. He realized something important. Boundaries had not created distance between them, they had created respect. One morning after breakfast, he placed a folder on the table. I want to talk about something, he said. Elena looked curious but calm. She wiped her hands on a towel and sat down across from him. This is a written agreement, Daniel explained. It clearly outlines your duties, your pay, and the option to stay here as long as you want, as long as the work continues the way it has. She blinked in surprise. You didn't have to do that. I know, he replied, but I want things to feel stable. Clear expectations help both people. She opened the folder slowly. Her eyes moved across the pages, reading carefully. Daniel watched her expression change from curiosity to quiet relief. This means you're not planning to replace me? She asked softly. No, he said simply. You're doing a good job. She closed the folder gently and held it close for a moment. Daniel could see emotion in her eyes, but she controlled it. Thank you, she said. That small moment changed something deeper between them. Alina no longer felt like she needed to prove her value through anything other than her work. The written agreement gave her a sense of security she had not felt in a long time. Over the next weeks, the ranch became more alive than it had been in years. Alina began suggesting improvements for the kitchen and house. She reorganized storage areas, planted small herbs outside the window, and even convinced Daniel to repair the old dining table that had been unused for years. Daniel noticed himself talking more, not about personal pain or old memories, but about daily life. He shared stories about difficult winters, stubborn cattle, and lessons he learned from his father. Alina listened with interest, asking thoughtful questions. Their conversations felt balanced now, two people sharing space respectfully instead of one person trying to gain emotional advantage. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by unexpectedly. Mr. Collins, an older rancher from nearby land, came to borrow equipment. He walked into the kitchen and paused when he saw the organized shelves and fresh bread cooling on the counter. "Well, this place looks different," he said with a laugh. Alina introduced herself politely. "Mr." Collins nodded approvingly and whispered to Daniel later, "You made a good hire." Daniel felt proud hearing that. Word slowly spread through the small community that Daniel's ranch was running better than ever. People noticed the improvements. The house no longer looked forgotten. Even Daniel himself seemed less tired, but progress did not mean life became perfect. One evening, Alina returned from town looking troubled. She tried to hide it, but Daniel noticed right away. She moved slower, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "You okay?" he asked gently. She hesitated before answering. "Someone from my past contacted me. They want money again." Daniel remained calm. "Are you safe?" "Yes," she said quickly. "It's just pressure messages. Reminders of old mistakes." He nodded, understanding that financial problems often followed people long after they tried to move forward. "You don't have to handle everything alone," he said carefully, "but you decide what help you want." She looked grateful for the offer, but also determined. "I need to handle it myself," she replied, "but knowing I have stability here helps." That night, Daniel sat outside longer than usual, thinking. He realized that leadership was not about controlling someone's life. It was about creating a safe environment where people could grow without fear. The next morning, Alina returned to her usual routine with renewed focus. She worked harder than ever, experimenting with new recipes and planning meals ahead for the week. The kitchen became her space again, not a stage for emotional strategies, but a place of skill and creativity. Weeks turned into months. Seasonal changes came slowly. The fields shifted from green to golden tones as summer approached. Ranch work became heavier, and Daniel often returned home exhausted. Yet every evening he found a warm meal waiting and quiet conversation that helped him relax. One evening after dinner, Alina spoke thoughtfully. "I used to believe that survival meant attaching myself to someone stronger," she admitted. "But I think I was wrong. Stability comes from building something yourself." Daniel nodded. "It takes time to learn that," she smiled slightly. "You helped me learn it." He didn't respond immediately. He simply accepted the compliment with a quiet nod. Another change appeared gradually. Laughter returned to the house. Not loud or constant, but genuine moments that made the long days feel lighter. They shared jokes about stubborn animals or funny mistakes during cooking experiments. The ranch no longer felt like a place frozen in grief. One afternoon, Alina showed Daniel a small notebook filled with ideas. "I've been saving money," she explained. "I want to open a small cafe in town someday." Daniel looked at the pages. Recipes, budgets, sketches of tables and menus. The dream felt real. "You could do it," he said honestly. Her eyes brightened with hope. "But I'm not rushing," she added. "I want to be ready." Daniel respected that patience. It showed growth. As months passed, their relationship settled into something rare, trust without expectation. They supported each other without crossing boundaries. Daniel realized he no longer worried about misunderstandings. The early tension felt like a distant memory, and Alina no longer tried to gain security through charm or emotional pressure. She gained it through skill, discipline, and self-respect. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, they stood outside watching the sky change colors. "Life feels different here," she said quietly. "It does," Daniel agreed. The ranch had become more than a workplace. It had become a place where both people healed in different ways, not through romance or dramatic change, but through steady respect and honest effort. Months passed at the ranch, and life had settled into a steady rhythm. The early tension that once filled the mornings was gone. The house was calm and warm, filled with the gentle sounds of life. The clatter of pots in the kitchen, the soft hum of a radio, the occasional laughter from shared stories. Daniel had grown used to the presence of Alina, not as a disruption or a worry, but as someone he could rely on. Her skill, her carefulness, and her steady work had become part of the ranch itself. Alina, too, had changed. She moved with confidence, but it was the kind of confidence that comes from stability and self-respect. The nervous energy she had carried when she first arrived was gone. She no longer felt the need to impress anyone. She understood her value came from her work, not from charm or manipulation. Each morning she prepared meals with focus and care, and each evening she returned home to rest without the weight of fear pressing on her shoulders. One afternoon, Daniel returned from checking the cattle earlier than usual. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the golden fields. He found Alina outside, kneeling by the herb garden she had planted near the kitchen window. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "You're early," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "Fields took less time today," he replied. He paused for a moment. "You've done a lot here since you came." She shrugged lightly, hiding her modest pride. "I just wanted to help the house feel more like a home." Daniel nodded. "You've done more than that. You've helped me." Her smile softened, and for a moment neither spoke. The wind rustled through the grass around them, carrying the faint scent of herbs and fresh soil. In that quiet moment, Daniel realized how much life Alina had brought back into the house. It wasn't just the meals or the clean kitchen. It was the small touches, the warmth of conversation, the calm energy, the sense of order she brought into every corner of the home. Weeks turned into months and the seasons began to shift. Summer came with long, hot days. The cattle needed more attention, the fields required constant care, and the workload increased. Yet even in the busiest days, the mornings were calm. Breakfast was ready, coffee was hot, and the house was organized. Life had found a rhythm that neither of them had anticipated. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned a soft shade of pink, Alina brought up something that had been on her mind for months. "I've been thinking about leaving," she said carefully. Daniel looked up from where he was repairing a fence post. "Leaving?" She nodded, her eyes distant. "I mean eventually. I've been saving money. I want to open a small cafe in town. It's a dream I've had for a long time." Daniel studied her. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty. She had planned carefully, learned how to manage her money, and had been patient in waiting for the right time. "That sounds like a good plan," he said finally. "It's smart to work towards something stable." She smiled faintly, relief visible in her expression. "I wanted to tell you I didn't want to just leave without saying anything." Daniel nodded. "I appreciate that. I'm proud of you, Alina. You've done well here and you'll do well anywhere." Her eyes brightened slightly at his words. There was no flirtation, no expectation, just honesty and respect. Over the following weeks, Alina's preparations for her future cafe became more intentional. She kept working at the ranch, but she began organizing her ideas, planning budgets, and gathering supplies. Daniel watched her with quiet admiration. She had grown so much, not just in skill, but in confidence and independence. One Saturday morning, Daniel noticed something different. Alina was up earlier than usual, gathering items for her notebook and working quietly at the kitchen table. The sunlight poured through the windows, and for a moment the house felt alive in a new way. "Coffee?" Daniel asked, entering the kitchen. She smiled without looking up. "Yes, please, thank you." He poured the coffee and handed it to her. She took it with a small nod, eyes still focused on her plans. Daniel realized how far she had come, from someone who had arrived with uncertainty and fear to a woman building her future with intention. As the weeks went on, the day of her departure approached. It was not a sudden decision or an emotional farewell. It was practical, just like everything else Alina had done. She packed her things carefully, making sure the house remained in order, leaving notes about supplies and the schedules she had kept organized. On her last morning, Daniel stepped into the kitchen to find her preparing breakfast as usual. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air, but there was a quiet sense of finality in the room. "You ready for today?" Daniel asked gently. She paused, looking at him. "I think so. It feels right." Daniel nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat he hadn't realized was there. He had grown used to her presence. She had brought warmth back into the house, and her departure would leave it quieter. But he also knew she was ready to take the next step in her life. "You've done more than I could have hoped for here," he said finally. "Not just with the work, but everything. You've made this place better, and you've made me better, too." Alina's eyes softened. "Thank you, Daniel. I wouldn't have been able to get this far without your guidance. You helped me see that I could handle things on my own." They shared a quiet moment, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but full of understanding. No words could capture everything that had passed between them over the months: fear, tension, growth, trust, and respect. When the truck she had purchased for her move arrived, Daniel helped her load the last of her belongings. She handed him a small envelope. "For you," she said. He opened it carefully. Inside was a small notebook filled with her favorite recipes, a note thanking him for his kindness and fairness, and a few sketches of the cafe she planned to open. Daniel smiled, touched by the thoughtfulness and sincerity. "Take care of yourself," she said softly, "and thank you for everything." Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "You take care too, Alina. You'll do well, I know it." The engine of the truck started, and she drove off slowly, waving from the window. Daniel watched her disappear down the road, the ranch quiet again, but the air lighter than it had been in years. After she left, Daniel walked back into the house. It felt empty, but not in a sad way. It felt like a home that had been prepared to welcome someone back whenever they were ready. He looked around at the organized kitchen, the clean floors, and the warmth that lingered in the air. For the first time since he had hired her, Daniel realized that what they had shared was not about romance or attachment. It was about trust, guidance, and respect. It was about two people finding stability in each other's honesty and support without needing anything more. In the weeks that followed, Daniel continued his work on the ranch with a renewed sense of purpose. He reflected on the lessons he had learned. Sometimes leadership meant creating boundaries. Sometimes kindness meant giving someone space to grow. Sometimes the strongest relationships are not romantic, but rooted in mutual respect and support. Alina's cafe opened successfully months later. Daniel visited one afternoon, walking through the small town to see the fruits of her careful planning. She recognized him immediately and smiled warmly. They spoke briefly, sharing a quiet moment of pride in her accomplishments. No awkwardness, no tension, just mutual respect and acknowledgement of the growth they had each experienced. As he walked back to the ranch, Daniel thought about the journey they had shared. The ranch had been his world, quiet and steady. Alina had brought life, warmth, and perspective into it, leaving it richer and more vibrant than before. And he knew that sometimes the most meaningful connections in life are not those that are loud or dramatic, but those that quietly change us for the better. The house was quiet again, the fields golden in the late afternoon sun, and Daniel felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He had learned that life could be shared with someone without complication, without misunderstanding, and still be deeply meaningful.